Thank you for calling the Astrological Commission podcast. My name is Issachar Bey, and I'm here with another great episode for you guys. We're here with a great astrologer, somebody who I believe has been pushing astrology forward, pushing the needle in the astrological community, and somebody who is a master astrologer. I'm talking about none other than Naomi Bennett. Hello, Miss Bennett. How you doing?
Fine, thank you. Nice to hear from you again.
All right. Naomi, could you explain to us how were you first introduced into astrology?
I was a college student in my first freshman year, and you could do your first research paper in English 101, and you picked any subject. And I just happened, out of curiosity, to pick astrology, and there were limited resources in the library, but you could do interviews. So I found out there was an organization called the American Federation of Astrologers that was based in Washington, D.C. And just as a historical note, that organization was organized during World War II. The government actually asked them to create an organization to create astrological propaganda against Hitler and the Nazis. And that's how they got their start. So I found out that by coincidence, the current president, a chiropractor, worked a mile from my house. I tried to get an interview. He was too busy. He recommended that I call Carl Pintopi in Tucson, Arizona, which I did. I thought I would be lucky to get a 2-hour interview, but he was so fascinating that we talked all evening. And I didn't leave till the next day, and I became his student at that point. And he had a private correspondence course with 700 students. Found out that he was one of the great 20th century American astrologers, that he was the original researcher, because at the turn of the century, in the 1920s, there was only the Theosophy Society and Madame Blavatsky, and that it was very esoteric. And so he and about 3 or 4 other guys, which would be Grant Louis, Sidney K. Bennett, whose professional name was Wins Astrology, and I'm trying to think of the great man who did the eclipses. Anyway, they did statistical research, and Carl was the master mathematician and statistician. And so they tried to prove what worked in astrology and what didn't, which also became the first of the real American astrology magazines. They all popped up during the Great Depression and World War II, and he was one of the major writers and contributors, because there was a team of New York astrologers that wrote for all the astrology magazines, and he and Grant Louis were best friends. And then he was still the top of his game all the way through the 50s and 60s. And when I met him in 1970, he had developed a weekly astrology column. But because he had been a newspaper man, he wanted to be in the comics, because the Sunday comics are the most read section of the newspaper for the entire week. And there were so many laws against astrology that if it was entertainment, then he could bypass all the anti-astrology laws that were there. And that's who I met, and it grabbed me by the throat and never let me go.
Wow. Wow. And could you tell us about, those who are listening, tell us about the uniqueness and the great system of the Carl Pintopi, the great Carl Pintopi's astrology system?
Mm-hmm. Well, he was right there along with Dane Rudyard, which a lot of psychological astrologers know that name, but they don't know Carl Toby, because he was an independent thinker, a researcher, and a maverick or renegade, because he had Sag rising with Uranus on the ascendant. And he didn't take anything for granted, which meant that he came up against the traditionalists the ones that were set in their ways and didn't want to listen to anything new, but he could back it up with the research he had done. And in some ways, he's a blend between the modern astrologers of today, the psychological astrologers, and the traditionalists, because he went back trying to figure out the fundamentals of astrology, and that is expanded in my book called Foundations of Astrology that you can buy on Amazon. And so if you're a traditionalist, you know the word thema mundi, which started in the Greek Egyptians, which is around 200 BC. And you can see that in the Temple of Dendera, where they say the sun and the moon exclusively rule the Leo and Cancer, and then there's co-rulership all the way down, that Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are co-rulers of the rest of the 10 signs. Well, there's a pattern behind there that none of the modern astrologers know, but Carl, the researcher, figured out, which is there is an astronomical basis of why those planets were assigned where they were. Because the Egyptians looked at the sky for 4,000 to 5,000 years old. So they didn't have telescopes. But with that level of observation, you can see long-term patterns. And with even visual astrology, you can realize that Mercury is a morning star, disappears behind the sun, and comes back out as an evening star. And Venus does the same thing. It'll be an evening star and becomes a morning star. And that's because inside the orbit of Earth, Mercury would go behind and in front of the sun, inferior and superior conjunctions. But behind that is an astronomical story. And I was so confused when I first did astrology because I didn't understand why the order of planetary rulership went Moon for Cancer and Sun for Leo, and then it went Mercury for Virgo and Venus for Libra, Mars for Scorpio. Why did it go Moon, Sun, Mercury, Venus? Because that didn't match the way I was taught about the solar system. Well, if you're in an Earth-centric, which is a geocentric position where you're observing the planets from Earth, what you find out is that Mercury and Venus spent more time behind the sun, away from Earth, than they do on our side, which means that from a mean average distance, the sun is physically closer to Earth most of the time than Mercury or Venus. You won't find that information in any astrology book. You will hardly find that information in any astronomy book. But the Egyptians figured it out, and they put it in the thema mundi, and they put it in the order of planetary rulership to the signs. Now, have you ever heard that anywhere? Have you read that anywhere?
No, I haven't. I have not. Nope.
Well, the astronomy supports it. So I was taught that, and I knew the truth of that from Carl back in the 70s, but it wasn't until Robert Hahn and the beginning of traditional astrology where they started retranslating all the Greek texts that I started looking in the 90s. I went to Egypt looking for artifacts. I went to the Vatican, not the Vatican, but the French the Louvre. And I didn't find it in the mummies. I went to London and looked at the British Museum. I found the answer, the picture, the thema mundi on an architectural magazine in the gift shop of the Louvre. And that's the first time I saw the thema mundi, which was the aha that I could start looking for the historical facts behind Carl's theory. Because in the mid-20th century, you didn't do your astrology books with references and footnotes like you do now. So that was the first piece. And then I was in a conference up in Seneca Falls with Robert Hand, you know, the three Roberts. Then it was just Robert Schmidt and Robert Hand. And I had lunch with part of the attendees there were incognito professors from the local university there that were in hiding. Normally, we as astrologers go to academic conferences. We're in hiding. No, they were in hiding. I had lunch with him, and I told that theory. And a young man, and he pulled out their laptops and proved in front of my eyes the astronomy that proved that to be a fact. However, I didn't have the software, and it took until YouTube and all of the videos that I found a video from another academician that was geocentric, and it showed the patterns of Mercury and Venus, and it proved without a doubt that Mercury and Venus spend more time on the far side of the sun from us than near, which is why we go moon, sun, Mercury, Venus. And so that's in my book, Foundations of Astrology, trying to find the evidence of the Carl Payne-Toppi discoveries that I knew that worked. And so that affects all of the medieval and traditional astrology, because then you go in when you discover the planet Uranus, and none of the astrologers have any problem about saying that Uranus, at least the modern ones, is assigned to Aquarius. And when they discovered Neptune, they said that had to be Pisces. But then the great debate started with Pluto. And most of us haven't looked at the old debate from the 30s and 40s. But by that order of mean distance from the Earth, Pluto has to be ruled as Aries, not with Scorpio. And that was because some of the astrologers politically didn't want to change their minds. They didn't care about the evidence. And so it got buried. So there is still a debate going on. What planet rules Aries? Well, I say it's Pluto, and I have the astronomical evidence to prove that, but the majority of astrologers say it's Scorpio, and that is a gigantic mistake, and it will take more analysis for anybody to change their minds. But the traditionalists, they avoid it all by only using the visible planets. So when you go through and use essential dignities and you look at all the Greek or the Arab references, they carefully avoid the N, the U, and P's, that's Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. But they use them in their forecast. They'll use them as transits. They just say they can't rule anything. But I think that's a mistake. So that was the biggest thing. Some of the old discoveries that he did was he analyzed thousands of marriages and divorces, and he found that the most important aspects you can have for a long-term marriage are sextiles. And that's another thing. Robert Hand hints at that all of our aspects are really a relationship of the houses to the ascendant. And your sextiles tie in the 11th house to the 3rd house of communication and friends. And so part of the things that you need in a good marriage is communication, and then having great friends and associations of people, whether it's family or the neighbors around you, that you get along and talk about your differences or create great debates. And so if you're going to recommend marriage between two people, it would be very handy to look at the sextiles between them if you want to look at a long-term marriage. That's just a small example, which is why that's why I've kept his books that were out of print. I have reprinted them. You can find them all on Amazon.com, because modern day astrologers need to look at that work and then assess what works in their client work and their research and what doesn't.
And so once you came into an encounter with Carl Payne Toby and you began to study with him, did you go to study with anybody else, or did you stay with Carl Payne Toby, and what happened after that?
In the 90s, I started going to all the astrological conferences because I had been independent and I'd had a big career. I was one of the first generation of women that were ever hired for corporate data communications, and I worked in the big computer companies. And that was because of EEOC and Title IX, that these entities weren't going to be able to only hire white males and have business with the government if they didn't hire women and minorities. And so I spent 11 years in corporate America selling data processing systems to banks and S&Ls and big corporations, which was an education in itself. So like most of us, when I had a Uranus opposition Uranus transit, which happens around age 42, I decided it was time to leave. And so I moved from LA to Texas, and it was one of the biggest real estate bargains in 40 years. And that's when I decided that I was going to go back to astrology and that I was going to connect with all my peers. And so I went to all of the conferences, which was mostly the Robert Hand things. He was the number one. And that's when I had time to take trips around the world. So I went to the Louvre looking for Egyptian artifacts. I went to the British Museum because they have a huge collection of artifacts. And I went to Egypt, particularly the Temple of Dendera. That's the most important for astrologers. Looking for the evidence, looking for the physical evidence, which was the Thema Mundi. And I found it in an French archaeological magazine in the gift shop of the Louvre. And what was it? It was that a sarcophagus, these sarcophaguses are around either 2 AD or maybe 1 BC. And you go in a museum, they always show you the outside of the sarcophagus, which is the face of the person that's been buried. No. Astrologically, the most important sarcophagus is the inside of the lid, because some of them have painted the goddess Nut, the goddess of the sky, and down 2 sides of her body are the signs of the zodiac, and they're divided between Cancer and Leo, which rules the sun and the moon. And then the dual rulership goes down, the body on the left and the right. Well, that was the big flight. That was the first piece of evidence. And then being able to connect in Seneca Falls with that mathematician, PhD, who pulled out his computer and proved to me that average mean distance was real, was another. And then I finally, in 2014, I was willing to write my book, Foundations of Astrology, because I had the concrete evidence to prove that the assignment of rulership was average mean distance from Earth. And then, Carl, in that division, there's another hidden thing. Remember, the Egyptian priesthood were a secret priesthood. The Greeks were too. It was their mainstay of money and authority over the government and their jobs. So they never gave away their secrets. That's the problem when we deal with Ptolemy. They were the first ones that wrote any books on astrology because all of this was secret society. You didn't tell your secrets unless upon death. And Alexander the Great, when he went through there, he destroyed Heliopolis, which had the greatest astrological libraries in the world. He killed the leaders. He killed the priesthood. He destroyed the books, just like the Catholic priest did in all of Central and South Americas. It's called Great Pillage and Burn in order to control the populace. And so the Greeks only got pieces of what was the original Hellenistic astrology the Egyptians had created for at least 2,000 years. So there are massive mistakes in our current astrology, and yet all of our astrological researchers, all they do is translate the Greek texts and make them better than the old translations. They have not gone beyond that. If you are a critical thinker, you have to do archaeology, mathematics, and historical references to pull out the evidence that was originally there. So I want to talk a little bit about houses.
Okay.
So this is part of the Carl Payne-Tobey discovery, but he did this because he was such a great amateur mathematician, and he looked for patterns in design. That was one of his great talents of that Uranus in Sagittarius on the ascendant, which was that Thema Mundi with the goddess Nut and the signs going down her body, is that you can read that as a clockwise count, or you can read that as a counterclockwise count. So in one direction, if you start with the moon, you get the rulership of the signs. But if you start the opposite direction with Leo and the sun, you get the rulership of the houses. And it's embedded there from the original sign from the very beginning. But like the Egyptian priests, you have to have the eyes to see. You have to have enough mathematical and astrological knowledge to realize, oh, there's a pattern left behind. And the Egyptians were masters at leaving esoteric messages in their pictures. In the Great Pyramid is nothing but one gigantic mathematical puzzle that if you have enough information, you can understand everything they're trying to send to you. And they were masters of that. That goes all the way past the Great Flood. I sort of want to talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
You ready for that story? Because, again, this takes us beyond the limitations of Ptolemy and Valens and the Arabs. And, let's not read this. Remember the Egyptians, their new year started when the sun entered Cancer. And that's because that is zero Cancer is the highest point the sun can rise in the northern hemisphere, which is why we have a Tropic of Cancer. And the lowest point is the first day of winter, which is the Tropic of Capricorn. Why did they do that? We have to remember that we currently, as astrologers, say our new year starts in the spring. No, it doesn't. That was because after Rome collapsed, after Alexander collapsed, the only people that kept astrology alive were the Persians. And they had spring as their first of the year. But that's not the design the Egyptians left. They said, no, we start at zero Cancer. And so let's just put that in there. There's a good astronomical reason for that. And they started when the sun entered Cancer, which is also when Sirius rose, and then that the Nile rose and the flood would occur. But that, again, is a very important point that astrologers have forgotten, is that our original New Year, and you could say this true even now in Europe, their New Year was at zero Capricorn, which is why we have the original pagan New Year was zero Capricorn, which is Saturnian. So you can either measure the sun at its lowest point in the year or the highest point. But currently, because of the Persians, we measure the year when the sun crosses the equator. But that's not the original design. So why did astrology even exist? So if you will start reading the books by Graham Hancock and the Orion theory, and then another man that's online called Randall Carson, because these are prehistory ideas that it's embedded in the astrological design. Randall Carson is basically a geologist, but an unconventional geologist is not attached to a university. And basically what they're all saying, that we had a catastrophic giant flood that occurred around 10,400 BC, which is the end of the Younger Dryas. And before that point, all of the Northern Hemisphere was in a great ice age and had ice up to a 1 mile high. And the current thinking is that we were hit by various asteroids, multiple ones, that started an extreme melt of that period of time. And there's evidence in the soil at that level that there's micro diamonds and a whole burn line at 10,400 BC, where basically all the icebergs melted, that we had a great flood around the world, which is why the myth of the great floods go over every single culture that has a living history. That is universal. But when Randall Carson goes back, let me take a sip of water a second. He goes back further, and he shows there have been at least 14 catastrophic events where life on Earth has died. You know, for example, the extinction of the dinosaurs, that basically we have been hit by big asteroids over the time where life on Earth has almost perished. And since the Younger Dryas, our oceans have raised up 400 feet, and many of all the original cities are always on coastlines. So these ancient cities are buried in the ocean. But whatever civilization was there when these floods occurred, it wiped everything out. Look what just happened to the Hurricane Helena and the mere flooding that happened in the United States. When oceans and rivers overflow, they take everything away with them. So in Netflix, Graham Hancock has a video called Ancient Apocalypse, where he documents this. But Randall Carson shows you that we probably had 14 events during humankind's existence where life on Earth has almost been destroyed and then had to rebuild. So this is why the Mayans are so afraid of Venus. Venus is a morning evening star. We think about it. There might have been a battle in the sky when you have these big asteroids where Venus might have been pulled by its gravity and Mars might have been pulled, and which is why we have the myth of dragons around the world. Think what a dragon is. It was probably a comet. So our myth of dragons in the sky probably come from comets, and the fear of dragons, the fear of comets, because they could destroy life in a second. And if you don't know it, in the news right now, we now have a second moon. A dark asteroid has been pulled into the orbit between Earth and the moon. It's so black that you can't visually see it except with the telescope. It's going to hang around for about a month until it pulls away from the Earth's gravity and goes on its way. Well, we happen to be in the half cycle, in the age of Aquarius, where we're going to the Tauride asteroid belt. And why do you think Jupiter is called the Great Benefic? It's called that because its gravity is so big that it pulls a lot of asteroids that might hit it. It pulls it into its field and it gets hit. And we have the last evidence of that in 1996, where we saw a gigantic asteroid hitting Jupiter that had wiped out the face of North America. So when I was in school, in elementary school, we didn't believe, this is the astronomy, that anything changed in the solar system. But look at the moon. It's nothing but pockmarked. And now we're finding gigantic craters all over the world. And we've changed our whole idea. And now we have a chaos theory that's taking in asteroids. Well, Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson saying it could happen again. And the fact that our solar system is going through this torrid asteroid belt, which is probably why we have the Day of the Dead and Halloween in late October, because that's when Earth goes through this asteroid belt. Isn't that just a little bit of interesting evidence? But it's the fear of the sky and trying to portend whether or not you're going to have catastrophic events, that the sky has been studied from the ancient world, and that the Great Flood really did happen. And as astrologers, we need to read our history and our archaeology and find out, the beginnings of why this study is so relevant today and still works despite the errors, despite the mistakes that are still in it.
Wow. Oh man, that's unbelievable. Yeah. One of the things that I also wanted to talk to you about is that, you see a lot of astrologers. You've always been connected to traditional research, archaeological research, just getting down to the core about everything. You also are one of the astrologers that I know of. I don't really hear too many people talk about the moon wobble. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how you use that?
Well, here we are. Tomorrow is the solar eclipse. And let's note that this eclipse period is square Mars, and look at the violence and the explosion of war that we now have between Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon. They're talking about Lebanon, and just today I posted on Facebook that Iran is thinking of getting ready to send missiles into Israel for what they did to Hezbollah, because it's Iran that funds Hezbollah, and Lebanon, it's Iran that funds the Hamas and the devastation of the Palestinians. So this is a very relevant topic, and we just happen to have a vice presidential debate tonight. So these are always big news items, big events, wars beginning in major turns in events, and many times more people die during this time. Look at all the big names that have passed in the past week or two. It just happens to be that eclipses are the biggest, reliable, predictable events, and they happen every 6 months. Now, why do I say moon wobbles? Because Carl did major research trying to figure out what worked with eclipses. And he did statistical research, and it's in my book called Moon Wobbles and Eclipses in Astrology, again, available on Amazon. There's 120 years of eclipse information and history that's in that book. Well, what he discovered was he first looked at fires in the 1930s from the statistics of the United States. He couldn't find any astrological pattern in fires in the United States. But when he took out and only looked at fires with loss of life, then he found out that there was a high when the sun and the lunar nodes were conjunct, and there was a secondary high at the 90-degree aspect, which is the square, which he termed moon wobble. But if you're a traditional astrologer, it's called the lunar bendings. And so it was that statistic that made him realize that you really have to look at the conjunctions and the squares between the sun and the lunar node. So because of that, I do my measurement of eclipses between the relationship of the sun and the lunar node, not necessarily right exactly at a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse, because when you look at that square aspect, which works just like any other eclipse, there is no shadow. There is no occultation because it's a square, and yet it works. What it says is that the power of that aspect is between the sun and the lunar nodes, not exactly on the lunar eclipse, not exactly on the solar eclipse. So I do all my measurement of eclipse periods is the relationship between the sun and the lunar node. So that means that if you look in ephemeris, you can sometimes see 3 eclipses. You could see solar, lunar, solar, or you could see lunar, solar, lunar. But the heart of that time period is when the sun is conjunct the lunar nodes, which was back in September 28th. And now we're at the end, another peak, which is the solar eclipse. But I say the heart of this eclipse period was September 28th, when the sun was conjunct the lunar nodes. Now we're going to have another peak, and then about another week, maybe 2 weeks, and then these aspects fade. How do I measure them? I measure at least a week before the first eclipse and the last eclipse, and I look at the peak at the moon wobble, which is the sun conjunct the lunar node, and I find it works. So if you want to look at that evidence, look at the book, Lunar Nodes and Eclipses in Astrology, and it'll give you all the background. So I am revising the book, Foundations of Astrology. It's been 10 years since I wrote it, and I've got more evidence to add to it. So there will be a second edition that I'm going to finish by the end of this year. And then I think I've said enough for posterity. At this point, I don't feel a great need to write another book, because they do take a lot of effort. But it's there for the people to discover what works, what doesn't work, which I call reliable predictions. You know, I was a psych major, and it was in clinical psychology, and we had to study lab rats, etc. And the one thing that you learn is that if you want to do behavior modification, like with a dog, it's called the Pavlovian response of if you give a dog, when it's hungry, enough food, it'll do tricks for you. But even if you talk to it later on, it'll salivate before the food's there. And if you do something called intermittent reinforcement, sometimes you give them the award, sometimes you don't, they will reliably, repeatedly give you that response over and over again. Well, that's the problem with astrologers and some of the techniques that we use, is we get a couple of good hits, like using secondary progressions or planetary periods, and they work sometimes, but they don't work other times. But if they worked a few times, we say, oh, this is a good technique. I'm going to use this all the time. What we don't realize is that you've got to look at reliable, consistent techniques to do your predictions on. Otherwise, you'll be like that salivating dog, and you'll make predictions that won't work because you have an unreliable technique, but you think it's going to work because it worked a few times before.
Wow.
So, here we cover.
And then I want to say right here, since we're talking about this, you know, one of the things I love about you is that you, those of who are listening, you can always follow her on Facebook or social media. She constantly posts charts on major current events, things that are happening in the right now. What do you feel about this year in the election? What are some of the things that you've been seeing, your discoveries, your insight on what you believe regarding this election?
Well, I have to admit I'm biased toward Harris, but when you look at the astrology, Harris has a slight advantage over Trump. However, right during the February 5th, you know, the pre-election, we have a very negative Mars opposition, Pluto. And it starts, in the early voting. It goes on during the counting period. I'm very concerned that we're going to have some level of riots or violence, or the Trumpers coming back in adamacy that the election is rigged. So this is not going to be an easy election. It's going to be by the hair of a chinny chin chin, simply because of gerrymandering in the Electoral College, which advantages the Republicans. But you can see in Georgia, if you've been listening to the news, that they have extreme MAGA people that have taken over the electoral board, and they are trying to change all the rules. And in the southern states, they have been getting rid of 50, 40,000. One state had 98,000 voters that were taking off the voting rules. And they're trying to disallow mail-in votes because that's usually to the Democrats' advantage. So I see this as a nasty fight that's going to happen. And I don't think it's going to be pretty or nice. The other thing is you're likely to see a flare-up going on between Iran and Israel. When are they going to actually shoot off those missiles? It might be during that time period. It's going to be a rough patch. Now, from a transit point of view, Harris Walsh looks just a little bit better than Trump, simply because she's got Jupiter in her 9th and 10th house of prominence, and she talks about hope. But when you think about all the shenanigans going on to alter the vote and who's going to be allowed to vote, then I think it's another story. So it's not going to be clean. I think it's going to be a real fight. So she could be like Hillary. She gets the popular vote, but does she get the Electoral College?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah. And then I wanted to
just say one thing. Remember what happened between Al Gore and George Bush. His brother, Jeb Bush, was governor of Florida, and the count came down to Miami. Most people have forgotten this history, and that was the hanging Chad, and it was all down to Miami, and they had sent the worst voting machines into the Miami districts between the poor and the colored neighborhoods, and they were doing that count. Who came in there but Oliver Stone with an RV, and they had a bunch of young males and harassed the election officials trying to do that count until the Supreme Court, which was Republican, said, stop the count. Because if they had finished the count, Al Gore would have won. So it's this kind of attitude. Right now, the Georgia Election Board, which is going to be fought in federal court, has said every vote has to be hand counted, no machine counting. That's one of the fights going on. So that's what I'm talking about. The stuff that you saw in Miami with Oliver Stone and basically taking the election away from Al Gore, we're going to see stuff like that again.
Wow. One of the things too I wanted to talk about real quickly was, when I first encountered you or had an encounter with you, we met in Austin, Texas. Tell us a little bit how you started your group, your astrological group in Austin, Texas, and how you were able to develop a great community there, and how it started and how it began to flourish, and, how you were able to bring in astrologers from all over the world to come and lecture.
Well, I didn't start the group. I inherited the group because one of the founders, the president, was getting a divorce and just didn't have time to run it. And so she threw it back to the group and say, here, you run it. Maybe it'll survive. Maybe it won't. And so 2 or 3 of us basically took it by, with $1,000 in the account, took it from nothing and one of the biggest problems about doing organizational meetings is finding a place that's affordable to meet. Because if you're trying to keep your membership fees low, then you have to have enough people. You want a space for maybe 20, 25 people. You can't afford $250 an hour. And so I was very fortunate that Dr. Will Morris, who is a PhD in Chinese medicine and a master medical astrologer, he ran a graduate acupuncture school with classrooms. And he gave us that classroom time at night on the cheap. And with that, we were able to keep the cost of the membership fees down and had enough money that I went out and found my favorite astrologers around the world. If you haven't listened to Rick Levine, he is a gem. In fact, you might listen to him about the planet Uranus with Chris Brennan on the Astrology podcast. He is a fountain of information. And then one of our great finds was Mark Jones. Do I have that? Yeah, Mark Jones out of England. He's a great psychological astrologer, very sensitive and beautiful British accent and a gorgeous face and personality go with it. And so we were able to bring in about twice a year weekend workshops with the best in astrology, and we could get people from around the whole area of Texas. And so we built that up. But at some point after 5 or 7 years, I wanted to hand it off, which I did to some other people. But I can say that they lost their space at the acupuncture school, and then COVID hit. And COVID did it in. So it's no more. There is a meet and greet group. And that really affected a lot of groups. I used to fly around the United States and do weekend workshops. And it was really wonderful because I could sell about $400 of books besides talking all weekend on my discoveries and my kind of astrology. And now you do Zoom lectures, which means, lucky for us as astrologers, you can drop in to a wonderful astrology conference or a meeting that's in Scotland or down in Australia, and you can do that in your home. But there is something that's missed when you can't go to dinner with them, that you don't hang out at lunch, that you don't have these side conversations. That has been eliminated. But to learn astrology and be exposed with it through Zoom is a wonderful gift that we have now, but there's another side that's been lost. So if you're a serious student, you should at least go to 1 or 2 conferences so that you can experience the in-person uniqueness of meeting your favorite astrologers or your idols in person. It does make a difference.
Definitely. And so, Naomi, where do you see astrology going? Where do you see, because I believe that it's an important science. It is definitely important. You're on the front lines keeping us informed about all the stuff that's going on in the current events. Where do you see astrology going in the future, and how do you feel about the state of astrology as it is now?
Well, the thing that really made astrology explode the most was Neptune and Pisces. And we're coming to the end of that time period. Neptune in Pisces gave astrology a gigantic boost because everybody became more receptive to the esoteric. And believe it or not, during the pandemic, you were home, you couldn't go out, and you really used Zoom and the internet to be able to keep in touch with the world. So the World Wide Web and Neptune and Pisces has been the great gift. But that's about to end. Just like the American Astrology magazines at the end of World War II, they were never the same in the 50s and 60s. And it was only a couple of years ago, all the hard copy astrology magazines, including the Mountain Astrologer this year, is no longer in print. It's all digital now. But we do have a hope. I've been pushing the American Federation of Astrologers to digitize their astrological magazines. They hold the biggest library of 20th century astrological magazines in the world. And only if you go in person do you get to see it. But if we could get those scanned, then every astrologer around the world could be exposed to what the discoveries happened in the 20th century. So in some ways, the digitization has made everything more accessible no matter where you are in the world, which means, because I was invited to India twice to astrological conferences, that there is a marriage going on between Indian astrology, modern astrology. We have been sending modern astrologers to China for about the past 20 years, teaching them Western astrology. And then we've had this resurgence of traditional astrology. We need a merger of the best of these three systems into one. So part of my effort is to at least merge the traditional with the modern, which is exactly what Carl Toby did for the past 50, 60 years. It's exactly what I've been doing for the past 30 years. And that is to happen in front of us. Is that this century we should have a merger of these ideas. And even if you listen to like Austin Coppock, who talks on the Astrology podcast with Chris Brennan, even though he specialized in the decans, he's been studying Indian astrology. So there is this merging of astrological knowledge, but it needs to be put in a synthesis of form. And I think that's what's ahead of us. Neptune going to Aquarius. I don't really see quality astrology ever going to AI, but your astrological columns, if they haven't already done it, are being written by computers and bots, not by people. But that's the lowest level of astrology. Until you get beyond your sun signs and transits with the moon on a daily horoscope, you haven't begun to touch the depth that's in astrology. And it's there for the serious student, and at least it's becoming more accessible. But I think as we know it, it's got to evolve. And so that's for the next generation. I'm hopeful for the Pluto and Sagittarius generation, really, to be the torchbearer while Pluto goes into Aquarius, because they're both fire signs. They're just too young to be leaders yet, but their day will come.
Well, Naomi, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on this podcast is because we wanted to give you your flowers, and we wanted to let you know that we appreciate your contributions, and also all of the things that you have done to push astrology forward. We are definitely appreciative of your contribution, and we wanted to give you your flowers and tell you that we love you. We thank you for everything you're doing. We enjoy your content. We enjoy your insight on all of these things that are going on. As a matter of fact, every time something happens, we're all looking at your page to see you're putting the charts up. You're explaining everything that's happening. Just from an astrological insight perspective, it's awesome to be able to see how everything correlates, how you're able to show us astrologically everything that's happening in right now time. And so, we wanted to say thank you for that, because, believe me, it is a great, great, great honor for you to do that. And I know it takes time. It takes, you taking the time out of your schedule to do those things and, to present that to us. And we are forever grateful for it.
Well, thank you. That is my intention when I post on Facebook or Instagram or Threads, and you can find me under Naomi C. Bennett to find all that. And the books that are all on Amazon, that is intentional for people to discover Carl Payne Tobey, to find my research. But the biggest point is to have social media have a quality product, and then to do just enough explaining that I use these world events to teach you how astrology relates to the world events, like that solar eclipse that's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
If you need to reach me, I do have, my email is naomibennett9@yahoo.com. And then all the books are on Amazon. And there's only one that is they're all on, some of them are in ebook form. And there's only one that is an audio book, and it's Carl Payne Tobey's Collected Works, because I have so many diagrams that you can't do an audio book and give it justice, because there's no way you can describe all the pictures and show all the charts in it. So that's the only one that's an audio book. But it's also the most beginner book of all, is Carl Payne Tobey's Collected Works. So I gift you all the exploration of astrology and to learn the best of astrology. And don't believe the TikTok stuff. That's the lowest level, and the sun sign stuff. But it's a start to get the curious looking for deeper answers.
Well, Naomi, thank you so much for your insight today on history, on wisdom. We appreciate you. And we like to say this one thing: we love you, and there's nothing you can do about it.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to your podcast. Thank you so much.